If you've watched football for any number of years, you've probably heard recently the phrase, running backs don't matter, which is a confusing phrase, right? And obviously it's hyperbolic. Of course they matter to some degree, but how can a running back not matter that much? We just saw Saquon Barkley be an MVP candidate and win a Super Bowl. Just the year prior, we saw Christian McCaffrey get MVP votes and nearly win a Super Bowl. And if anything, the position should be becoming more and more valuable, right? Because teams are trying so hard to defend the pass, they're putting two safeties deep, meaning that you have to run the ball more, so running back value should be more important. And it's true, rushing is higher now than it has been in previous years. It's actually much higher now than it has been in previous years. So why is that the case? And if it is the case, shouldn't running backs matter more? Well, let's get into it a little bit deeper. So first, I'm going to talk about a stat called EPA per play, which is a bit of a confusing stat, so just bear with me. But this is the chart I'm going to start off with, which is I'm going to look at the dropback EPA of the team that was first in the NFL and last in the NFL, and then the rush EPA of the team that was first and last in the NFL. You see the difference all the way to the right. The average team passing, not the average team, but the best team in the league, the Baltimore Ravens, the difference between one pass that they would throw and one pass that the Cleveland Browns would throw was about half of a point per pass. Whereas for rushing, it was down to over a third of a point per pass, or per rush, So still a difference, right? But if you extrapolate that for a full game, again, I'm kind of brushing through this because we don't need to get into the weeds, but essentially, throughout the course of a season, the average rushing team that is best in the league is 150 points better than the worst rushing team in the league. The average passing team in the league is about 300 points better than the worst passing team in the league. So that's part one, right? Passing just matters more. And really, I don't need a stat to tell you that. You kind of know, yeah, passing is obviously the most important aspect of football, but that still means a third of the game is rushing, right? So clearly, running backs matter. Well, just because rushing still matters a lot and is still a third of the game doesn't mean that running backs account for all of that. And I think that's actually the biggest thing that gets missed here is how much credit you have to give the offensive line on a given running play. And there really isn't a great stat to show this, so what I decided to do was dive into some film. So what I decided to do was I wanted to look at Saquon Barkley, because let's be honest, he's the kind of the key guy we talk about now with running back value. He just signed a deal that he felt like wasn't what he deserved, and then was a big part of a Super Bowl winning team. But what I wanted to do was go through an average Saquon Barkley game and just determine how much of his rushing yards was due to the offensive line and due to him. Now, this is inherently a subjective measurement, so it is not, exact, but, again, I couldn't think of a better way to do it, so this is how I'm doing it. So this was the game I chose. It was the Packers-Eagles playoff game, and the reason why I chose this game was because that is where he had the closest to his average yards per game in this one. This play that I'm showing on the screen is actually a bit more of a complicated one, so let me explain. You see, Saquon Barkley is going to take the handoff right here. I paused it right now. He could just run forward, and I can guess kind of around how many yards I think he would get had he just done that, but he decides to be a little creative here. You're going to see him bounce things to the outside and ends up picking up 16 yards on this play. Really good play by Saquon Barkley. How do I measure something like this? How much more yards do I say is attributed to him versus the offensive line? Well, what I essentially decided to do was just guess. If Kenneth Gainwell was out there, I don't know, I think it'd probably gain around 6 yards if he just ran straight forward. Since Saquon Barkley was there, it was 16, so I'm giving Saquon Barkley 10 yards. I did that for every single rush in this game. Honestly, the vast majority of rushes in a game are something like this, where watch what happens. You're going to see that Barkley just tries to run through the gap that's there and just gets tackled because there was nothing he could do. He did what the offensive line could give him, right? And that is the vast majority of plays that you'll see. Even big plays. This one, which was kind of the, a big play. It was the one to ice the game, and he could have picked up a ton more yards. He could have had a 75-yard touchdown had he wanted. But the reality is, if Kenneth Gainwell was there, Kenneth Gainwell still picks up the same amount of yards that Saquon did. So I'm not giving Saquon any extra credit here. I give credit to the offensive line. So there were 25 attempts in that game, and on 20 of them, I did not give Saquon any extra yards, positively or negatively. There's some where it's like, okay, you might have fought forward and gotten an extra yard than Kenneth Gainwell would have. My kind of rule of thumb was, if I feel like it's more than 1 yard, unless it's like you're juking somebody out or something, I'm not really going to go too hard one way or the other. Yards can add up over the course of a game, but that's just how I viewed it. But yeah, there were 5 total plays. One of those was actually a negative play where he took a different gap trying to gain more yards and actually lost more yards than he could have gained. But as a whole, he gained 17 total yards on his 25 carries. If you extrapolated that for a 300 carry season, he would have only added 204 yards over the course of a season, which is not nothing. That definitely matters, but isn't crazy, right? You wouldn't go after one running back too hard if they just had 200 more yards rushing than someone else, right? However, this is unfair because one of the things that Saquon's known for is his big splash plays, right? Where he jukes somebody out and is able to, not just gain 16 yards due to a great play, but he's able to, the offensive line gets him 15 yards, and then he gets another 40 and is able to score a long touchdown. So how do I add those? He had 6 rushing touchdowns of 50 or more yards on the season, which is a crazy high number. And this is where data can get a little bit skewed, right? Because if I choose a game like I did, the Green Bay Packers game, where he doesn't have one of those carries, well, then it makes his overall numbers look worse, right? But if I happen to choose one of the, handful of games where he did have one of those carries, well, then it would make it seem like his average game is significantly better. And while I could have just, evaluated every single game he had this season, I'm not going to spend the time to do all of that. What I decided to do instead was simply just evaluate those long rushes and then take the average and, spread the yards out through every game he played this year. If I did that, it's now 348 yards on a 300 carry season, if you count those long rushes, which is definitely more significant, but still, that doesn't seem that crazy, right? And again, it's different than, say, a wide receiver who had 348 yards in a season, right? Because it's different values, of course. But that is essentially the argument, is that while a running back usually carries the ball a lot and often has to take a lot of physicality to have the season that they have, usually the majority of plays they're out there for that they run the ball, it is the offensive line who deserves the credit, not the running back. But when the running back makes a big play, that's very exciting, and when they build up bulk stats, they are the ones who get the credit. In that Packers game, the person who got the post-game press interview was Saquon. But the question I would have is, if Kenneth Gainwell was out there in that game, and I mean, he was out there, but he was the backup, if Saquon Barkley got injured and Gainwell was the guy who took the vast majority of those snaps, took every snap Saquon did, what would have been different? A little bit. Definitely some would have been different. But I think Gainwell would have still had over 100 yards, and maybe he would have gotten the interview at the end instead, right? That's kind of just the argument, right? There are other things that have to be mentioned when it comes to running back value. I think the biggest one, and this is so difficult to figure out how much it actually matters, but play action or the threat of a running back in general. You have Saquon Barkley in the backfield. That can adjust strategy, right? Teams will play for Saquon Barkley, and you can throw down the field. Now, people have ran studies on this, and play action doesn't really have that much of an impact, whether you run the ball a lot or a little. And in fact, it has essentially no impact. There's no correlation there. There is some correlation for like obvious passing situations versus obvious rushing situations, but in terms of if you throw the ball or run the ball a lot, there is no difference there. But I don't know. I feel like if you have a good play caller, that's the whole league. If you have a specific situation where you have a good play caller and an elite running back, I think it could make a difference in that situation perhaps. But how much, I just don't know. There's the other things that with running back value that we kind of have to talk about. Like for one thing, it is true that when a running back gets injured or leaves, usually the backup running back plays quote unquote great. Right? I mean, the example I would think of was when Todd Gurley got injured and they decided to go with C.J. Anderson. People were like, wow, they signed him off the street and he's playing great. Or maybe he's just, the offensive line is playing great and he's just not getting those extra yards that Gurley got, but there still is enough yards there that it feels like he's playing great. There's also the longevity talk that we all know about. Running backs don't play for forever, but to me, that's kind of a different point because people aren't really arguing that people should pay running backs for a long period of time. And while that is a pretty good argument for why you maybe shouldn't draft a running back, because, if you draft a great tackle, you might get 15, 20 years out of a great tackle. You draft a great running back, you're not going to get, you might only get a third of those years. But when it comes to free agency, I mean, who cares, right? Saquon's going to be good for 3 years probably, so it's not a horrible deal there. So I don't know if I love that argument, but I do understand it, I suppose. A couple other points. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Saquon Barkley is not just someone who adds value through the running game. He can add value through the passing game. And I'm not talking about what I talked about earlier, play action and stuff. I mean, just legitimately, he is a good receiving halfback, and that can add value that way, right? So there are other ways a running back can add value. But ultimately, there is a reason why Saquon Barkley was never an MVP candidate until he joined a team with an elite offensive line, right? At the end of the day, it is a player. It is someone who matters on a football team, but it is not the most important factor. The running game does matter, and I think that paying attention to the running game might make more sense. Yes, it might make more sense for a team now to put more resources into a good run-blocking guard than it would have made sense in 2020, right? That's how football works. Things change. Strategies change. But if you're a team with a bad offensive line and you go out and say, well, look at Saquon Barkley, let me add Najee Harris and try to replicate it, I don't think it's going to go well. So that's kind of my main thought on it. Do running backs matter? Sure. Am I fine with a Saquon Barkley contract? Yeah, I am. I think that makes sense. But I don't think that running backs are undervalued. In fact, I think if anything, they're probably still a bit overvalued. And I'd be very hesitant to draft one in the first round. But that's just how I see it. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.